The blood around me begins to ripple. Rising through the wet surface were dozens of heads. A slick crimson sheen over featureless faces, void of eyes, nose, and mouth. They were human-shaped, and nothing more. They swam slowly towards him, escorting me along the way. A pyramid of skulls protruded from the sea of blood. From the various orifices of each skull poured forth even more blood. The pyramid was capped off with the throne, which was itself made of bone. A large figure sat atop, his eyes like burning suns floating side by side in a vast empty space. An impenetrable blackness beneath a gray hood. His tattered robe like tangled webs that swayed with an absent wind. I craned my neck as I came closer to the pyramid. A massive structure of thousands of skulls, he watched me without speaking. But I felt him. I felt his aura of evil. It permeated this chamber more intensely than any of those prior. Loki and Hel were already at the pyramid. They stood beneath an archway of an opening which led into the interior of the bone structure. I climbed from the blood and joined them. I turned back to look at the mannequin-like beings who had accompanied me. They remained wading in the blood, observing me, it would seem, but lacking any features to observe with. "What now?" I asked. Loki motioned toward the interior. There was a faint glow within. I gripped the handle of my sword, steadied my breath, and entered the pyramid. Candles flickered along the floor, a floor made of stone rather than bone. In the middle of the room was an altar. A man lay supine atop it, his arms and legs restrained. I glanced upwards. He, the one who awaited, sat above us, unseen. I returned my gaze to the man on the altar. He was alive, although aged and frail. "Who is he?" I asked. Nobody responded. I turned around and found that Loki and Hel were not with me.
"He wants you to remember,"
a female voice said softly, startling me from behind. A woman had emerged from a dark corner. Silky auburn hair and youthful skin, she was healthy in a way I had not seen since entering the tower. Inviting in a way I had not experienced. In her outstretched hand, an apple. "You're Eden," I muttered. She gave a slight smile. A tired smile like that of Frigg, but beautiful. An out-of-place beauty, like a lone flower in an ashen forest. The apple in her hand had shone golden, although not in a metallic sense. It was a plump, healthy, edible gold. Odin, Thor, Frigg, they told me to eat the apple, that doing so would be my only hope of escaping. I reached out and took it from her hand. I could feel the energy pulsating inside it. I looked at Eden and said, "Why does he want me to remember?" There was a pity in her eyes when she looked at me. She answered,
He wants you to remember, so that the truth can be revealed.
I looked at the apple in my hand. The truth will set you free, right? I just hoped in my case that was literal. I sunk my teeth into the crisp golden fruit. The effects were instant, like waking from a dream. I had been so limited before, so restrained from my true self. People often complain about how difficult it is to run in a dream like slogging through mud. As Nate, the path was muddy. But not anymore. Not as Balder. I could feel that I had changed physically. My muscles were larger, firmer. I no longer looked like Nate. My body was strong. Fatigue dissipated entirely. I felt my facial structure and hair had changed, and was Balder's once again. But one thing remained. I looked at Eden, and she back to me. We recognized each other. And just like my mother, Frigg, had noticed, she too said,
Your eyes are the same.
I smiled. Hello, Eden. I turned around to see who was lying atop the altar. He was older than I remembered, but I recognized his face. Frey? He looked weakly in my direction. His eyes began to water. You're alive. His voice trembled. I placed my hand on his. Yes. You have to stop him. I glanced to the ceiling. The robed figure I'd seen earlier was not familiar. Who is he? I asked. Frey opened his mouth to answer and was interrupted by a deafening shriek. I fell to my knees, the sound pierced into my soul. I pressed my hands to my ears. I felt as if the high-pitched sound was drilling into my brain. Suddenly, it stopped, and the pyramid abruptly expanded outward. The skulls separated and hovered mid-air, as if gravity had left them. They grew further apart, and then it became apparent that at some point the location of the pyramid had changed. What we were in was no longer a large yet confined chamber. This was a massive, fiery expanse. A river of blood ran through a landscape of bone upon which walked hundreds of featureless human forms. They hammered iron and dragged chains. They hand-cranked ancient machines. They smelted rock and sharpened bone. They were working. For what reason, I could not see. I glanced upward to the throne. It had vanished. Frey remained restrained to the altar, and Eden stood near. Behind them, Loki and Hel. I was overcome with rage, swept by the realization that I was once again capable of hurting a god. I gripped my sword and charged towards Loki. He uttered, holding in front of him a sharpened shaft of mistletoe. Having been a human, I can attest to the idea of mistletoe causing pause to a god as seemingly silly. After all, it's just mistletoe. But it is, for that reason, mistletoe being so harmless to all, that it is the most harmful to me. The truth is that within all things there is life, a cosmic energy that has filled all vessels big and small. It is in me, it is in you, it is in the mistletoe. And it takes a shape which we might call a soul. It becomes a unique form of the whole. Gods and humans are not far different. We are simply different kinds of vessels, and gods themselves vary from other gods. My mother Frigg could communicate with the souls within all things. When I was born, she had all agree to never harm me. The soul of fire, the soul of water, the soul of metal, the soul of stone, each and every thing. However, one thing did not agree. Mistletoe. Why did mistletoe not agree? Fate, perhaps. It is not as if mistletoe is particularly disagreeable. Frigg shrugged it off, however, saying to herself, well, it's just mistletoe. But she kept it a secret regardless, until one day Loki manipulated her into revealing the truth. My invulnerability was entertainment to many. They'd shoot arrows at me just to watch them bounce off. Loki took advantage of this. He replaced an arrow with a pointed shaft of mistletoe and tricked my blind brother Hod into shooting it at me. Perhaps you already know the story of how I died. And here I was again, faced with Loki holding the one thing that could kill me. But this time, I was ready. He'd only succeeded before because I had not expected it. What do you want, Loki? I asked. Me? He chuckled. It is he who summoned you. He pointed past me. I watched Loki, hesitant to turn around while he still held the mistletoe. Loki rolled his eyes and tossed the mistletoe over his shoulder into the river of blood. Happy? He asked. I looked at him a moment longer and then turned back around. Where he stood was a great distance away, off in the fiery horizon. But the one who I'd seen sitting upon the throne was different now. His height stretched miles above a giant of mountainous proportions. His sun-like eyes appeared as if to scale, almost too bright to even look at. He moved forward a step, his tattered robe so long that I could not tell if he were walking or floating. In a single stride, he covered a length that would have taken a man an hour to traverse. I watched in awe, still unsure of who this being was. He stopped several miles from me and knelt down, his web-like robe now so large that it was resemblant of something like a massive storm cloud. He towered over me, glaring with his burning eyes, and I noticed that within his hood was not a vast empty space, as it seemed from afar. He had a face. It was made unclear by shadows, but nonetheless, he had one. "Boulder!" he said. It was both a whisper and a roar, a thunderous vocalization which simultaneously shook the ground and clawed at my skin. I could feel his breath like a humid gust. "Tell me who you are," I said. He laid out an enormous pale hand, palm up, quaking the ground as he did so. Pointed fingernails large enough to be the hulls of ships extended from his fingers. A shiver ran down my spine as I reluctantly scaled his hand and into his palm. The giant stood, miles above the ground as he lifted me. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, from the shadows beneath his hood, he appeared. A copy of the giant who held me, but the size of that which I saw seated upon his throne atop the pyramid of skulls. A giant still nearly 20 feet tall by my estimate, but not nearly the size of the behemoth which held us. He drifted down the arm, his own arm, and joined me in his palm. He towered over me, watching me as I shuddered.
"I was born from blood,"
he began.
"that which your father and his brother split, blood which drowned many and became the ocean. Do you know whose blood I speak of?"
I nodded. Ymir.
"Yes, from Ymir's flesh the earth was shaped. From his bones, mountains, stones from his teeth, seas from his blood. But what you do not know is that some of that blood leaked through into the core of the earth, and it changed."
What is your name?
"You know my name."
Then say it. He reached to his hood and lowered it. I recoiled at the grotesqueness of what I initially thought was melting flesh, but soon realized that what I was looking at was a face akin to those I'd seen below. The featureless human-shaped forms. But he was not featureless. Not anymore. His mouth was torn flesh. An opening that had not been there in an earlier time. His eyes were glowing red orbs that seemingly burst through the skin. His nose jagged slits. His ears were massive punctures in the side of his head. He observed my reaction for a moment, then stepped closer. I stumbled a step back.
"Are you frightened, Boulder?"
He asked, showing his pale, empty hands.
"I do not carry mistletoe."
I did not respond.
"All of the gods know my name, but they did not know me as I am."
He said. Who are you? I gripped my sword tighter as he moved another step closer.
"I was not meant to exist, but there is a soul within all things, Balder. You know this, and there was within the blood of Ymir one very powerful, one that willed itself to be born. It grew into something faceless, a shape, a prison of flesh which it tore through. And here I am. I see, and I speak, and I hear the satisfying screams of those who suffer within the tower. Those who once celebrated the spilling of Ymir's blood!
The grisly figure moved even closer, driving me toward the edge of the hand. I glanced down at the distant ground below.
"Celebrate me, Balder!"
He roared.
"The doom of the gods is upon you, and it is more than an event. I am that doom. I am that which the prophets speak